Hi everyone, this is Andrew Prima, Ukrainian American, reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, week 98 of Russian aggression of Ukraine, and this is the second week of January 2024. In today's podcast, we're gonna talk about the latest updates on the war, and we're also gonna cover what the US plans to do with aid to Ukraine and actually, US supported confiscation of Russian frozen assets. But what's next? So, the latest updates Ukraine remains the object of war, of destruction, and Russia continues to insist to destroy Ukraine completely. If there is any doubt about this, look at what is happening in the territories invaded and annexed by Russia. Ukrainians must give up their identity, freedom, language, and culture, the right to self determination, and even then, they are subject to repression and all kinds of human rights violations, including mass murder and torture. For those who believe that this war can be ended through negotiations, yes, probably. There is an option to negotiate, however, on Russian terms, and totally to betray Ukraine, which is totally unacceptable because Putin doesn't even want to think about any negotiations that will allow Ukraine to survive and be independent from Russia. Putin actually keeps on repeating, we are the same people, Russians and Ukrainians, but actually we are not. Ukraine is a separate country with a separate, totally different culture and different beliefs. We all must understand one simple fact that without arms supplies, Ukraine will not be able to force Russia to negotiate on any good terms for Ukraine. This means that the only way to end this war remains the same as in February of 2022 to give Ukraine everything it needs to change the military situation and thereby force Russia to make concessions. The best would be to force it to completely withdraw from Ukraine. So, air war. The biggest news of recent days was the appearance of ballistic missiles of North Korean production. According to what Kiev and Washington officials said, they are called Hwasong 11G or KN 23, which run on solid fuel, weigh about 3,500 kilos at launch, and are very similar to Russian made Iskander missiles. One was released already on December 30th last year, and there was also few of them used on January 2nd of this year. They seem to have hit something because the Americans say that the results are still being assessed. All these were launched in Kharkiv region and the Parisia regions. These regions are poorly defended by foreign and Western air defense equipment. So the American Patriot air defense systems would be good systems to shut them down, but due to the low numbers of such systems, Russians used it at advantage and shell on the cities that are close to the Russian border, which is Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Kryvyi Rih, Kherson. Judging by the various videos over the last few days, there are definitely different models of MPK UMPK glide bombs with slight differences in their design. Some have guidance systems and others still don't. So the Russians are also in the process of receiving advanced Shahed kamikaze drones from Iran. One version should be reactive, the other should be additional has should have additional equipment on them, including the internal warhead. In the afternoon of January 4th of this year, Ukraine struck the Saka Air Base in western Crimea. The location of air defense systems in Jankoy in Yevpatoria Sevastopol in the regions near the Kerch Bridge, and then the Russian headquarters in Novofodorivka. It is actually reported that it's a quite successful strike and that actually killed up to 23 high ranking Russian officers. After the strike, there was at least one wave of drones, not only in the occupied Crimea, but also in nearby Belgorod region. So on the morning of January 8th, Russians conducted their third round of missiles campaigns this winter in response to this attack in Crimea. A total of 59 rockets were fired. Of them, 8 of them Shahid drones were shot down by Ukraine Defense Forces. Russians also fired 4 Dagger ballistic missiles, and none of them, unfortunately, was shot down by Ukrainians. Actually, we were able to shut down 18 out of 24 launch X-101 F555 missiles. The Russians also fired 8 missiles X-22 and 6 Iskander M and 2 X-31P missiles. The targets was again the targets were again Ukraine military facilities and production facilities of shells and drones. Last night, the Ukraine used the drones to attack the Engels air base in Russian territory and one of the oil storage facilities of Oryol region in Russian Federation. So the battles in Donbass continue as well. Yes, fighting is going on all along the front line and has been for several weeks because the Russians have become hostages of their own myth about Russian superiority in the Winter War, which is gladly accepted and spread in the West. And not only various Western experts, but also crowds that support Putin believe so. But accordingly, they advance in Shinkivka area in the first estuary and towards Kupiansk, from the Kislivka village toward Kupiansk, and from Kuzhimivka in the direction of Borova. To the south, they advance from Kremenaya village in the direction of Liman, from Solidar in the direction of Siversk, and from Bakhmut in the direction of Slavyansk. At the same time, there is not much can be told in regards to the new gains or losses, because for months, and despite continuous fighting, neither side is making any progress. The Russians have troops and a lot of armored vehicles, but they have problems with commanders and communication systems. The Ukrainians have fewer troops but enough firepower to defeat any Russian attack, or at least regain any territory they may have lost. Overall, regardless of which side claims the attack and capture, overall progress is very minor. It is little different in the Bakhmut area. As you know, the city has been totally erased from the earth. You can only see the ruins of the old high-rise buildings in any facilities that used to used to be used by regular civilians. Over the past few weeks, the Russians have advanced northwest of the destroyed city and pushed the Ukrainians back to Bogdanivka village. Returning south, they advance into the forest north of Klishivka, so far with some local success. Ukrainians have carried out several local counterattacks in the Avdiivka region over the past few days. For example, 2 days ago, Ukrainians pushed back the Russians from Stepovoy to the railway embankment, and in the south, they captured the strip of terrain east of the city. However, Kiev's officials still are trying to deny or ignore the fact that the Russians cleared all of Marinka village and advanced further to the west and south. Of course, the city was completely destroyed, and the Russians completely bled the army of DPR. But Marinka is now under their control, unfortunately. In turn, at the beginning of the month, the Ukrainians counterattacked further south from the village of Novomikhailivka to the southeast and pushed back the Russians. In general, it's not much, but thus both the old railway line to Mariupol, interrupted since the beginning of the war, and the new one remain within the range of Ukrainian artillery and rocket launchers such as HIMARS and MLRS. So, for example, at the end of December, the Russians carried out several attacks between Noropokrovivka and Verbove, which is Robotne district. Yes, some of them managed to break through the Ukrainian front lines, but at the same time, the 82nd Brigade counterattacked and, with the support of M142 and M270 rocket launchers, which destroyed about a dozen Russian guns, not only returned most of the lost terrain, but also wedged itself into the Russian trench system, connecting heights 161, 162, and 166. Finally, a bridgehead on the left bank of the Dnipro River in the Kherson region. For example, Ukrainian Marines claim to have repelled at least 8 additional Russian counterattacks in the Aleshek and Krynki area just in the last 36 hours. At the same time, an entire Russian airborne battalion, under the commander of Colonel Armon Ospanov, was destroyed, and Ospanov himself died. According to reports of Russian social networks, the Russians in the area lost up to 90% of their combat vehicles, but they still keep counterattacking. So we all know that the US funding for Ukraine dried up. Republicans and Democrats are fighting on the Mexican wall, aid to Ukraine, and aid to Israel. So we all know Ukraine heavily depends on Western aid, and the US funding and military aid is crucial to defend against the Russian aggression. So what's the Washington is thinking and what they're going to do next? So the White House supports the confiscation of Russian assets in favor of Ukraine. Yeah, that's great, of course. We also support. The only problem is that neither the White House nor Ukraine has anything to do with these assets. At the moment, around 300 billion of the Russian central bank is frozen, but they suspect something like that. It's so they place 300 billion in the European Union, minimizing American assets in their reserves, and the decision on the confiscation will be made by the European Union, not the White House. Does such a decision by the White House in principle increase the possibility that the frozen assets will be confiscated? Theoretically, yes, because it strengthens the voices that will demand exactly such a decision from the European Union, and the money that was still in the US will not hinder us. On the other hand, it is quite possible that in the future, frozen Russian assets will become the subject of blackmail from the US in case of Trump's victory. For example, when the US government says that Ukraine doesn't need financial support from Washington because it has these assets in Europe, so let's allow Europe to confiscate them and pass to Ukraine. Moreover, Trump supporters and Trump himself may well state that military aid from the US should be paid by Europe because Europe has the Russian assets. It's pretty much a repeat of Mexicans will pay for the Mexican wall. So the US should buy weapons by paying American arms manufacturers with Russian money. Who in the US wouldn't like that? That's perfect because the defense sector of United States will be supplied with more money and Ukrainian forces are going to get more arms. So it became known that three committees of the House of Representatives of the Congress, which are headed by Republicans, published a document in which they severely criticized the Biden's administration for insufficient aid to Ukraine. It was called the plan for victory in Ukraine. Actually, it was already discussed before, and now it is being discussed more and more actively lately. There, among other things, it is proposed to immediately provide Ukraine with the necessary weapons, including ATACMS and F-16s, and to return frozen Russian assets to Ukraine. So the combinations of these 3 points, the military aid, that we really need, the tightening of sanctions so that the Russian economy begins to collapse as quickly as possible, and the third point, the $300 billion of frozen Russian assets. If it all boils down to a pile, then this is where the key to our victory lies. In Republican circles, the vast majority of politicians are adequate. There are Trump supporters who are actually populists, who fed on hype and nothing more. And the sober minded part of Republicans is adequate. And Nikki Haley is a great example of that when she says absolutely reasonable things that resonate in the heads and hearts of very, very many Republicans and ordinary Americans. So I think it's just a sign that we're on the right track. If we also work with the Republicans, but do not interfere in any way in their internal party debates and discussions, then the decision to provide Ukraine with assistance will be made in the near future. And in general, Republicans' demands are correct. Why can't we still get the same long range missiles for 3, 5 kilometers and not only defend against those missiles that are launched from the same Russian Saratov airfield by planes of the Russian strategic aviation, but hit these planes on the spot? Why can't we get a Russian $300 billion for a war against Russia itself? All this talk about how this might in some way violate international law is for fools, because the Russian Federation, which trampled international law repeatedly and brazenly and with great pleasure, should be treated in the same way so that it understands what it is doing. So there is a lot of smart stuff in this document. And I think that if both Democrats and Republicans unite in the desire to help Ukraine, then very, very quickly the situation on the battlefield and before in Russia itself will begin to change in our favor. Regarding Russian frozen assets that might be provided to Ukraine, I would like to add that it's obvious that there are two ways of using these funds. And in order to rebuild what we say can be rebuilt now, although the risk of the Russian aggressor using the same missiles doesn't appear anywhere. But the same applies to the purchase of weapons for Ukraine. And this, by the way, removes huge internal problems in some countries. The same in the US, because very often some populist Republicans accuse Biden of spending American money on distant Ukraine. Like hey, why we have to do that? Because we have our own problem in America. Why we should give the money? So if you don't want to give the money from the American budget, let Russia suffer for its atrocities, and let's take money in the frozen assets, assets of Russian Federation, and give the struggle in Ukraine. So if this confiscated money goes to the purchase of the weapons we need from the Americans themselves, so then discussion will stop. So we truly believe that the key is the frozen Russian assets that can be spent for Ukraine using the American defense sector that can produce all the weapons that we need to defeat the enemy. Ukraine will win. It will take some time, but unfortunately, we heavily depend on foreign aid. And if this aid is provided, we can win this war sooner. It protect our land, our nation, our people, and protect the democracy. Thank you for listening. If you like my podcast, please share with your friends.